Oca i Sina i Svetoga Duha, Care nebesni, utešitelju duše istine, koji si svuda prisutan i sve ispunjavaš, riznicu dobara i davaoče života, dođi, useli se u nas i očisti nas od svake nečistote i spasi dobre duše naše. Slava Otcu i Sinu i Svetome Duhu, i sada i uvijek i u vjekove vjekova. Amin. Gospode, pomiluj, Gospode, pomiluj, Gospode, pomiluj. Vladeku sveti, blagoslovi.
Христе Боже, благослови собрание сие во славу Твою, всегда ныне и присно, и во веки веков. Аминь.
Amen. Please have a seat. Your Grace, very reverend and reverend fathers, dear brothers and sisters, dear guests, on behalf of His Grace, our Bishop Longin, on behalf of our cathedral clergy, on behalf of the executive board and entire community here at our cathedral, I wish to welcome you to this symposium in particular, and to celebration of the saint and life of Saint Mardarија. I won't be giving any long introductions. Bishop Longin was supposed to be here, but he's at the airport waiting for His Holiness Patriarch Irenei, who will lead us in this 3-day celebration. As you can see, we have a schedule for today. Our first presenter today is Dr. Srđa Trifković, who really needs no introductions in this community and in Serbian church and Serbian community in general, but just a few words about him. Dr. Srđa Trifković is a Serbian-American writer, an international affairs and foreign affairs editor for the magazine Chronicles. He was director of the Center for International Affairs at the Rockford Institute until 2008. He was a spokesman for the former president, advisor actually, for the former president of the Republic of Serbia, Vojislav Koštunica. Dr. Trifkovich is the author of many books, among which Sword of the Prophet, a book on the history, doctrines, and impact of Islam on the world. He comments on Balkan politics and is a regular columnist for several conservative publications in the United States, if there are any anymore. Dr. Srđa Trifkovich has been teaching since 2012 international relations at the School of Politics and Political Science at the University of Banja Luka. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Srđa Trifkovich.
Your Grace, Reverend Fathers, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be back at what used to be my parish church for a great many years, and in particular to see some of the old friends whom I haven't seen in a while. I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation to accompany my lecture, which is in Serbian. So for those of you who may not be completely fluent in English, and I know we have some guests from Serbia, they will be able to follow what's going on the screen. Let me also add that even though I may have tried somewhat too ambitiously to cover a long and vitally important period in Russia's history, the period during which Mardarija was in Russia from 1907 to 1917. I've actually tried to pack it inside 1 hour, and that may not leave too much time for Q&A because there is a long afternoon ahead of us, but I will nevertheless try to speed it up somewhat so that we can have at least a little bit of discussion at the end. At the turn of the 20th century, Russia was, as it is today, the biggest country in the world. Through the centuries, it had expanded from the territorial base in the Great Duchy of Moscow as a means of compensating for the lack of natural obstacles which has enabled foreign invaders to threaten Russia's heartland through the centuries. To the west, Russia is wide open to the North European plain, which extends from northern Germany across Poland and today's Belarus. From the east, and particularly from the southeast, Russia is vulnerable to the raiders of the steppe. And indeed, the most dramatic experience in Russia's whole history was in the early 13th century when the Mongols conquered the Kievan Rus, pillaging, burning, and killing their way across what is today southern Russia. And the Mongols only stopped at the edge of the forest, so that it was only the northern parts of Rus that remained separate from the Mongol fiefdom, and that in a way contributed to Russia's separation from the European mainstream. Historical roots of Russia's insecurity, which resulted in the need to compensate for the lack of natural obstacles by creating territorial strategic depths, are well justified. After the Mongols, and this is the upper left, came the Swedes and Teutonic Knights, stopped by Alexander Nevsky in 1240 and 1242 respectively, culminating in the famous battle on the frozen Lake Peipus, which was immortalized in Sergei Eisenstein's movie of 1938. Then, upper right, came the Polish invasion at the time of troubles in the beginning of the 17th century, when the Poles even entered the Kremlin. Then, of course, in 1812, the Napoleonic invasion, and in 1853, the Crimean War, when the British and the French joined forces with the Ottoman Empire against Christian Russia in preventing Russia's exit to the Bosporus and Dardanelles. So what is sometimes described in the Western media and political discourse as Russia's paranoid tendency and the sense of insecurity which results in aggressive behavior is in fact rooted in amply documented historical experience. In the century preceding the Great War, we had 99 years of relative peace in Europe, interrupted only briefly by relatively short, relatively limited wars, including that between Germany and France in 1870, which had particularly grave consequences. After a period of political instability in 1848, the European continent was also relatively stable, talking about internal political order for the rest of the century. However, in the period after the unification of Germany in 1870, we suddenly have certain systemic disequilibria in the European system for the simple reason that Germany became so much stronger than any single European country. So that what started as a concert of Europe at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and was reinforced by a period of reaction after the revolutionary years 1848-49 suddenly became a much more calcified system of rival alliances. Particularly after Otto von Bismarck was replaced as the German Chancellor in 1890, the relations between Russia and Germany deteriorate, and Russia enters an alliance with France, which would have seemed illogical for the simple reason that Russia was autocratic, Russia was orthodox and conservative, whether France was radical, Masonic, and Republican. The period of Nicholas I from 1825 to 1855 was in many ways a wasted opportunity for Russia to carry out necessary reforms which would enable her to maintain her position as the preeminent power in Europe that she was in 1815. However, and above all, what I have in mind is the institution of serfdom, which had definitely outlived its usefulness and its logic, and prevented Russia from modernizing at a time when other European powers, primarily Britain and France, were speedily embarking on the program of industrialization. In fact, under Nicholas, we had 30 years of both social and economic as well as political stagnation, and he also made a major strategic blunder in 1849 when he sent an army of 100,000 to crush the Hungarian Revolution in the name of dynastic solidarity with the Habsburgs. In fact, it would have been far wiser to let the Habsburgs stew in their own juices, to let an independent Hungary emerge on the ruins of the empire, and thus to prevent the perennial rivalry between Austria-Hungary and Russia in Southeast Europe for the remainder of the 19th century, which was one of the main causes of the First World War. Be that as it may, the Crimean War was a wake-up call for the Russians because their defeat at the hands of industrially much more advanced Britons and French, who were able to bring heavy artillery, to construct railways from disembarkation points to the siege of Sevastopol, and the general mood of despondency when Russia had to sign the Treaty of Paris and demilitarize the Black Sea, meant that Nicholas's heir, Alexander II, could in fact embark on the program of reform because there was a sort of consensus within the Russian ruling elite that things simply cannot continue the way they used to be. My apologies, my own. For the rest of the 19th century and for a decade and a half on the eve of the Great War, Russia was perennially torn between modernization and political stagnation. The political system was still strongly autocratic, based on the principle of the grace of God, and it was not subjected to any limitations by any other institutional mechanism. At the same time, reforms usually occurred as a result of pressures of detrimental events rather than well thought out and comprehensive strategy. After Nicholas I, we have three emperors who had very different temperaments, characters, and convictions. His son Alexander II, known as the Liberator because he liberated the serfs in 1861, was in many ways a westernizing European and a liberal by the standards of 19th century Russia. He was certainly committed to the program of gradual incremental reform which would bring Russia in line with the Europe of her time. After he was murdered in 1881, his son, Alexander III, was very much an antipode to his father, conservative, decisive, strong, and strongly autocratic. Also extremely suspicious of the West European values, of the spirit of liberalism, of the spirit of secularism, which he sensed was sweeping the West. And then after he died prematurely at the age of 49 in 1894, came his son, Nicholas I, well-meaning but waverer, and in many ways a limited weakling, a man who was often willing to accept the opinion of the last person he spoke to. Particularly tragic moment in Russian history was the assassination of Emperor Alexander II on 13th of March 1881. Because not only did Alexander liberate the serfs in 1861, but almost 2 decades later, he was intent on granting Russia a constitution and of trying to give impetus to the development of representative bodies. To that end, he entrusted General Mikhail Loris Melikhov, an Armenian Russian, with the task of drafting a constitution which was meant to provide for early forms of representative bodies, very far from constitutional monarchy or democracy, but certainly a step in the right direction away from the rigid autocratic system of Nicholas I. In January 1881, Alexander approved Loris Melikhov's draft, and ironically, on the very day when he was assassinated, 1st of March, old style, 13th of March, 1881, later that day, there was supposed to be a meeting presided over by the Tsar to officially promulgate this document. However, his heir, Alexander III, immediately reverted to the positions of autocracy and discarded Loris Melikhov's project. Alexander III's Svengali in this endeavor was Konstantin Pobyedonosov. I would call him an Orthodox Puritan. He was very well academically impeccably groomed lawyer who knew not only civil law and criminal law, but also canonical law, and for that reason was appointed Oberprocurer, secular overseer of the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church, which was an extremely important position, the one that de facto gave him control over administrative and even doctrinal affairs of the Russian Church. But he was also a determined foe of any compromise with the spirit of the time and an enemy even of modernization itself. He believed that any form of reform would undermine the metaphysical meaning of monarchy, which was strictly hierarchical and vertical and based upon divine and not man-made concepts. Pobyedonosov believed that reforms would open the floodgates of chaos and would threaten metaphysical foundations of Tsarism. As former tutor to Alexander III, he was very influential, and for the rest of his reign until 1894, Pobyedonosov was probably the most important, the most influential figure in the country after the Tsar himself. At an advanced age of 79, he finally gave up the post of Oberprocurer because of the decision of Tsar Nicholas II to institute the Duma, which came as a result of revolutionary events of 1905. The reign of Nicholas II started with a tragedy on the day of his coronation, when hundreds of people were trampled to death in a human stampede. But oddly enough, he nevertheless decided to follow the program to the letter, which in fact created a very bad impression with some people, that after such a major tragedy, the day would end with a ball. Also, at the beginning of his reign, addressing the representatives of local self-governing bodies, the Zemstva, he decided that he would not accept their moderate requests for consultation before the new important legislation was promulgated. He said, somewhat insultingly, that such proposals were senseless dreamings. And the Tsar's categorical refusal to allow even modest forms of participation in the process of legislative reform disappointed even the most loyal monarchists. At the same time, while the political system was not being reformed, Russia was speedily entering a globalized world. And indeed, by the end of 1880s, we could say that the world was being globalized on a grand scale. There were no longer vacant territories any longer. The world was entering from the Columbian into the post-Columbian era, to paraphrase Sir Halford Mackinder. The steamship, the locomotive, the stock exchange, and the telegraph were the symbols as well as the tools of this modernization. In the 30 years preceding Nicholas II's ascension to the throne in 1895, railways in Russia went from 8,000 miles to 24,000 miles, and the speed was gathering pace, fueled by the European, mainly French capital investments. Around 1900, the Russian Empire was at the peak of its territorial expansion and was also embarking on an important geopolitical project, which is the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, which would open up the spaces and riches of Siberia and the Far East and the Pacific region, and would fortify Russia's position as an important player and possibly a hegemon in the Far East. However, Nicholas was a weak Tsar. Alexander III was a true strongman, literally and figuratively speaking, decisive, bold, very strong and rich personality. The new Tsar was not ready for the task. He ascended to the throne and was ill at ease, managing his advisors and often allowing them to gain control over him. 23 years later, he lost both the crown and the life his own and that of his family, without ever making a truly bold move of his own volition. From the diary of Nicholas II, which he maintained for years almost on a daily basis, what transpires is a solid bourgeois of limited intellectual abilities, a family man, strongly family man, who treats the routine of his responsibilities as something that has to be completed without passion and without intellectual elaboration of the meaning and the nature of the problems facing the nation and the state. The Tsar was blessed to have a hugely talented man as his finance minister. His name was Sergei Witte, the Count of Dutch origin, who was Russified and who was extremely able in attracting foreign investment in the 1890s, in designing the expansion of Russia's railway network, and in speaking up for the industrial circles, for capitalists, against the landowners, in the process of trying to push modernization forward in the first years of the 20th century. Specifically, he wanted to settle millions of Russia's peasants who didn't have large land holdings in the Far East and Siberia and along the Amur River Valley. However, large landowners were resisting this because they wanted Russia to remain based on agriculture and on resources, much as it is today, and much as the oligarchs in Russia today want to keep it that way. The conflict between landowners and the upholders of spontaneous economic modernization came to the fore during the construction of Trans-Siberian Railway. Witte, as I mentioned, wanted to bring landless peasants and settle them so that Russia would, both in geopolitical terms and in economic terms, finally make use of its huge empty land east of the Urals. He also wanted to lower the class tension in European Russia by sending landless peasants away to Siberia, where each would be promised 15 hectares of his own, provided that he pledges to stay for at least 20 years. This battle, unfortunately, Witte did not win. And the emperor and the family and the political elite supported the landowners. As Witte says in his memoirs, my idea of settling peasants in the East encountered stiff resistance. And I quote, many influential landowners in the aristocracy and their representatives in the bureaucratic circles of St. Petersburg openly were saying that if the peasants were to leave, the land would get cheaper and there would be less labor, so that working the land would become more expensive. And it is desirable that the workers are hungry because they cannot find work, because then labor is much cheaper, end of quote. Now, such defeatist and catastrophic policy undermined Witte's plans for consolidation of the Russian Far East and also prolonged misery and tension in European Russia. Young Mardarija Uskoković, hero deacon, arrived in Russia in the spring of 1907, exactly at the time when the reforms of Witte, having been defeated, were rejuvenated by a new chief minister, Peter Stolypin. A few words about him a little bit later. Mardarija remained in Russia until the fall of 1917 and left it for good exactly at the time when the provisional government was brought down by Lenin's coup d'etat. It was later called a revolution, but it was not exactly a revolution. It was, in fact, a classic coup d'etat carried out at the time when the provisional government was on its last legs. A little longer than 1 decade of Mardarija's sojourn in Russia corresponded to the most dramatic social and political events in that country. And exactly at the time of his departure, those events had an extremely tragic outcome. Mardarija during that decade was in many ways disappointed in Russia. The reality of Russia often did not correspond to Mardarija's youthful love of Russia and his a priori belief in the world historical significance of the mission of Mother Russia. And that's the kind of sentiment that used to be typical for many denizens of Montenegro, who even without ever stepping onto Russian soil, identified with an idealized image of Russia as the savior of the mankind and the pillar of Slavdom. It is almost touching to see the gap between Mardarija's idealized image of the imperial institution and the crisis of legitimacy of Russian monarchism in the years preceding the First World War. During Mardarija's first journey to St. Petersburg in 1907, the political system of Russia was in turmoil. The crisis, which reached its pinnacle shortly before his arrival in 1905-06, had an acute character. Russia's defeat in the unnecessary and extremely unpopular war against Japan in 1904-05 indicated structural weaknesses of the Russian military and the Russian Navy, but also of the society as a whole. 1905 was the year of revolutionary turmoil, which heralded the drama of 1917. That year started with tragic events of 22nd of January. On that day, military units, or rather the officers, panicked and ordered military units to open fire on thousands of peaceful workers with their family members who were carrying icons, not red banners, and who were led by charismatic priest Georgy Gapon. Their intention was to present the Tsar with a petition asking for bread, peace, and protection from arbitrary power. Several hundred people were killed, over 1,000 were wounded. And after this Bloody Sunday, as it was remembered, the reputation of the Tsar suffered long-term damage, which eventually proved irreparable. But always trivial in his diary, the Tsar recorded these seminal events, often in English, mostly in English, very briefly, without commentary, and in the same breath with other trivia of his daily routine. At what time he got up, who came to visit him and have tea, what animals, and particularly birds, he shot during the day, and so on. After the Black Sunday on 22nd of January, the Tsar merely noted, and I quote, "A difficult day. In St. Petersburg, there were serious disorders because of the wish of workers to come before the Winter Palace. The military had to shoot, and there were several dead and wounded. Oh God, how difficult and how painful." In fact, the military did not have to shoot, the Tsar was not even at the Winter Palace, and there were not several dead and wounded, but hundreds. Events were in fact slipping out of Tsar's control. Under pressure, he issued an ukaz on perfecting the state order, which for the first time introduced a constitution of sorts, the manifest of 30th of October 1905. The real author was Count Witte, back in office, who insisted on the principle of guaranteed citizens' liberties, civil liberties, on the abolition of the state of emergency, and the establishment of the Duma, not as a legislative body, mind you, but as a consultative one, nevertheless the first step towards representative democracy. Instead of pacifying the masses, the manifest caused new disorders, remembered General Anton Denikin, who was later to be one of the leaders of the white factions during the Civil War. And I quote, "On all sides we heard the cry, down with autocratic government, down with local authorities appointed by it, down by the military command, all power to the people." The Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers and their deputies, and strong strike committees emerged, and the authorities in many places lost their calm. However, by the time of Mardari's arrival in 1907, the order was returned in many ways thanks to an extremely talented and dynamic and determined man, Pyotr Stolypin, the chief minister. This was indeed a different Russia. The State Duma was founded, after all, and traditional institutions were shaken. Among the Russian ruling elites in the aftermath of 1905, the reformist, westernizing wing prevailed. And it was indeed embodied in the dynamic chief minister, Pyotr Stolypin. As the chief minister of the Russian Empire in 1906, he started a program of reforms which eluded Count Witte a few years earlier. that program of reforms he was determined to defend against both right conservative forces and against the left radicals. It was also under Stolypin that pre-revolutionary Russia witnessed its economic flowering. Already by the end of the 19th century, Russia had intense economic development of about 8% a year, which was comparable to China after the reforms of Deng Xiaoping. It was the highest growth rate of any significant country at that time. Thousands and thousands of miles of railways were built. There was immense influx of West European, primarily French capital. In 1880, foreign investment in Russia was under 100 million rubles. By 1890, 215 million. In 1895, a little under a billion. And by 1914, 2 billion rubles. The Russian economy by 1913 was producing 35 million of tons of coal and 4.12 million of tons of iron every year. So this was actually quite serious. By 1913, Russia was, by GDP, the fourth most developed country in the world, the fourth biggest economy. So much for the myth of the backward and reactionary Russia. However, this also resulted in major social changes. The rate of literacy was expanding, and also the sophistication of the urban middle class. At the same time, unfortunately, state structures were not following the society. On the eve of the Great War, there was a multi-million industrial proletariat in Russia, particularly in the industrial centers, not only in St. Petersburg and Moscow, also in Kiev, in Odessa, in Perm, in Tula, and other places. New factories, trading houses, banks, insurance companies and transport companies were being founded every day. The result were magnificent palaces, shopping centers such as the well-known GUM on the Red Square, and hotels such as Moscow's Metropole. In the process of urbanization, Moscow and St. Petersburg already by the 19th century exceeded 1 million inhabitants each. Stolypin's reforms were indeed politics as the art of the possible. He was determined not to be defeated as Witte had been. He wanted to create a large segment of small landowners on whom the authorities could rely, instead of the cooperatives which had collective ownership over land, which was not an efficient method of land tenure. He believed that the development of private initiative would also expand political freedoms, that in fact economic reforms would lead to political reforms rather than vice versa, and at the same time that Russia's agricultural products would become more competitive on the world market. As he stated to the Third State Duma in 1910, the land should not rule over man, but man should rule over land with a labor of highest quality, free and not forced labor. He did succeed, and millions of Russian peasants moved to Siberia and to the Far East. The social and political meaning of Stolypin's reforms, in his own words, were as follows. A small landowner, hard-working, who has the sense of his own worth, will bring to the village culture and education and property. And only then liberty of word will change to real liberty, which will of course be based on civic liberty and of the sense of state responsibility and patriotism. And indeed, this is an inspiration for Russia to this very day. Unfortunately, he was killed under somewhat mysterious circumstances. He was assassinated at the theater in Kiev in September of 1911. And this is my own photograph of his grave at the Pečerska Lavra in Kiev. In order for the program of reforms to be carried out, Stolypin insisted that Russia must have 2 decades of peace. And the reformist establishment was completely in agreement with this assessment. And therefore, after 1905, Russia conducted an openly defensive foreign policy. And this defensive foreign policy, without any attempts to project power, say, in the Balkans, was at odds with the principles of Mardaria's hopes and expectations, particularly regarding Russia's leading role in Slavophile attempt to bring the Slavs, and primarily Orthodox Slavs, under one Tsarist aegis. Mardarija was invoking Slavophile strategy, which at the time of Stolypin's reforms, neither Russia's official policy nor Russia's elite had any time for. In fact, Nijinsky's Rites of Spring, which caused a scandal in Paris in 1913, were a reflection of the very opposite of that romantic Slavophile spirit. It was avant-garde, it was European, it was westernizing, and it was most certainly not steeped in the sense, in the feeling of Russia's historic metaphysical destiny. To cut a long story short, at the time of Mardari's arrival in 1907, 19th century Slavophile thought in Russia was, in fact, in defensive. At the level of state policy, it had somewhat rhetorical reflection in the war against Turkey of 1877-78. But after Russia's defeat in the Far East and the revolution of 1905, with rapid economic growth and general modernization, Slavophiles were pushed away from the public scene. Control was taken over by technocrats, by Russia's westernizers, and by the upholders of realpolitik, which would be completely freed of any form of Slavic sentimentality and solidarity. A reflection of this real political course of St. Petersburg's diplomacy, without a trace of Slavophile sentiment, we can find in the behavior of the Russian foreign minister, Count Izvolsky. In September of 1908, at Buchlau, and I made these pictures of the palace at Buchlau, including the very room where Izvolsky was carrying his conversation with Ehrenthal. Izvolsky promised to Ehrenthal, the Austrian-Hungarian foreign minister, Russia's support for the annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina by the dual monarchy, if Vienna, in return, would support St. Petersburg's demands for free passage of Russian warships through the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, which was, by the way, forbidden under the terms of the Paris Treaty of 1856, which ended the Crimean War. The Buchlau episode to this very day is the subject of some debate among historians. Ehrenthal misused Izvolsky's indiscretion to carry out the annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina without granting Russia anything at all. But one thing is for sure, that the head of Russia's diplomacy was perfectly ready to surrender vital interests of a small Slavic nation, specifically the Serbs vis-à-vis Bosnia-Herzegovina, to subject those interests to Russia's relatively secondary interests in a relatively secondary issue. So Mardaria's disappointments regarding the Slavophile project were inevitable, no less than his disappointments regarding the mystical role of the Tsar and of the imperial institution itself. On the eve of the Great War, in fact, we had two firmly divided alliances in Europe. We had revisionist France, which could never be anything but an enemy of Germany, because in 1871, Bismarck made a big mistake by annexing two provinces, Alsace and Lorraine, and thus turned France into a perennial revisionist power. Russia was an ally of France because that was the only way to counterbalance an immensely powerful Germany, which was, in fact, by the 1890s, by far the most powerful country of Europe, and also which around that time became more important, more powerful economic power than Great Britain. Britain was without any formal obligations, but increasingly leaning in her sympathies to France and even to Russia as the result of Germany's erratic behavior, and in particular Germany's massive naval program. Austria-Hungary wanted expansion in the Balkans as a safety valve for her accumulated domestic problems, and yet the annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina limited her options by turning Russia strongly against Vienna for the remainder of the pre-war period. Italy was nominally allied to the Central Powers, but in fact there was no love lost, and if there was any territory to be gained for the Italians at some future point, it was definitely at the expense of Austria-Hungary, in Istria, in the Quarnero, in Dalmatia, in South Tyrol. Turkey, the sick man on the Bosporus, was almost pushed out of Europe in 1812. And finally, in Russia's case, we still have the need to buy time. Russia was undergoing a major program of modernization of her military structures and also expansion of the railway, which would be finished in 1917. But at the same time, after the annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, there was no readiness to purchase time at any price. We are not going into the details of the July crisis of 1914, a convoluted series of events that followed after the assassination of Francis Ferdinand in Sarajevo on 28th of June 1914. Suffice to say that it was to all intents and purposes, a joint criminal enterprise by Vienna and Berlin, where Vienna wanted Germany's protection against Russia to carry out a limited war against Serbia, and Germany wanted to use Austria's limited war against Serbia to cause a European war which she believed she could win and which would have the character of a preventive war before Russia becomes too powerful. The wave of patriotic enthusiasm and national unity on display in the summer of 1914 in Russia was not used, however, the way it was used elsewhere, including Germany and France and Britain, to create a broad government of national unity. In Britain specifically, it included even Irish hotheads. In France, it included both socialists and liberal radicals and conservatives. In Germany, the Social Democrats were co-opted into the Patriotic Front. Unfortunately, this moment was wasted in Russia's case, and already by the second half of 1915, as a result of military defeats which brought the Germans to the Kurland and to the borders of today's Belarus, Russia's Poland was conquered, and with the logistic difficulties encountered by the Russian military, 1/3 of soldiers were without rifles. The enthusiasm gave way to disgruntled and increasingly suspicious mood, which was fueled by the fatal role of an itinerant would-be monk, Grigori Rasputin, who contributed more than any single man to the discrediting of the royal family, coupled with the destructive influence of the Tsarina, who encouraged her husband to be, as she wrote in many letters, to be Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great in reigning, in imposing his will. And in fact, he was neither. He had no capacity to be either great or terrible. But he made a further blunder in 1916 when he assumed supreme command of the army personally, and thus became personally responsible for army's defeats. This, of course, in the winter of 1916-17, resulted in the massive desertion of the Tsar by not only aristocrats and landowners in whom he trusted and whom he supported against Witte, but also by the generals. And also the Duma started acting as a de facto revolutionary body. The result was the abdication of March 1917. The Romanovs fell with a whimper and not with a bang. At the key moment in 1917, the Tsar, deserted by everyone, proved to be weak and powerless. And on the other hand, Kerensky, at the head of the provisional government, was blazing the trail for the Bolsheviks. It is not my goal in this very short presentation to chart out the abyss, the road to abyss of the Russian state and the Russian society through the tragedy of the Great War, the July crisis, to the finale in November 1917 and the nightmare of the Civil War and Bolshevik terror that followed. On the revolution itself, enough has been written. Suffice to say that by that time, Mardarija was well enough acquainted by Russian circumstances so as not to be too surprised by what came to pass. The problem of relations between Mardarija and the Russian state and church establishment was not misunderstanding, as some commentators have written. My opinion is that the problem was in the fact that Russian decision-makers actually understood Mardarija's aspirations and hopes, but his ideals and his proposals they regarded as undesirable or even dangerous. And that was the tragedy both of Mardarija and of Russia herself. Thank you very much.
Oh